A prince worth $12 billion. A man who could buy anything on this earth. A man whose family name controlled governments and shaped history. That man was standing in a tiny marine research station on the coast of France. His hands were trembling. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. And across the room, standing in a lab coat 2 sizes too big with wild curly hair and a clipboard in her hands, was the woman who had vanished from his life 4 months ago without a single word. She looked up. Their eyes met, and the clipboard slipped from her fingers and crashed against the floor. Now let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever met someone for just one night and spent every single night after that wishing you had never let them go? Have you ever felt a connection so deep, so real, so terrifying that it changed something inside you permanently? And have you ever watched that person walk away knowing that you might never see them again? Because that is exactly what happened to one of the richest men in Europe. A man who had everything the world could offer except the one thing money could never buy. And the woman who could have given him that one thing disappeared before the sun came up. What happened between them that night will move you. How he found her again will shock you. But how this story ends, that is going to change the way you think about love forever. Before we dive in, if you believe that real love can find you when you least expect it, go ahead and hit that like button right now. And if this story moves you the way I think it will, you are going to want to subscribe. Trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The Montclair dynasty was not just wealthy. They were a force of nature. For over 300 years, the Montclair family had shaped the political and economic landscape of Europe. Their empire stretched across banking, real estate, energy, and international trade. Their net worth was estimated at over $12 billion. Their influence reached into parliaments and palaces across the continent. Kings sought their counsel. Presidents attended their galas. The Montclair name was not just a name. It was power made flesh. And at the center of this empire stood one man, Prince Julien Montclair, the youngest heir to the dynasty, the face of the family's future, and the most emotionally unavailable man anyone had ever encountered. Julien was 31 years old. He stood over 6 feet tall with a jawline that looked like it had been carved from marble. His storm gray eyes carried a weight that most people mistook for mystery or arrogance. His dark hair was always perfectly styled. His suits were always immaculately tailored. His presence in any room was magnetic and immediate. When Julien Montclair walked into a space, conversations paused. Women stared. Men straightened their posture. He commanded attention without ever asking for it. But that was the surface. That was the performance. Beneath the tailored suits and the billion-dollar smile was a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely happy. 3 years before this story begins, Julien had been engaged. He had been deeply and completely in love with a woman who came from another powerful European family. Their relationship had been celebrated across high society. Magazine covers called them the future of European royalty. Their engagement party had drawn over 500 guests from 12 countries. Julien had believed with every fiber of his being that he had found his person, the one soul in the world who saw past the titles and the wealth and loved the man underneath. He was wrong. 6 weeks before their wedding, Julien discovered the truth. His fiancée had been carrying on a secret relationship with his younger cousin, not out of passion, not out of some uncontrollable love, but because his cousin was positioned to inherit a larger portion of the Montclair trust. She had done the math. She had weighed her options, and she had chosen the bigger fortune. When Julien confronted her, she did not cry. She did not apologize. She simply looked at him with cold, calculating eyes and said, "You should not be surprised, Julien. In our world, love has always been a transaction." That sentence did not just break Julien's heart. It destroyed his belief that love could exist at all. From that day forward, Julien built walls so high and so thick that no one could reach him. He smiled for cameras, but the smile never reached his eyes. He charmed diplomats and dignitaries, but the charm was rehearsed and hollow. He attended galas and fundraisers, surrounded by hundreds of people, and felt more alone than if he had been stranded on a deserted island. Women pursued him relentlessly. Beautiful women, powerful women, women who would have done anything to stand by his side. But Julien saw through every one of them. He saw the calculation behind their laughter. He saw the ambition behind their affection. He saw his ex-fiancée's cold eyes reflected in every smile directed his way. So he stopped trying. He stopped believing. and he adopted a pattern that became his emotional armor. Attend the event, pour the champagne, enjoy the temporary company, and wake up alone the next morning, feeling exactly the same emptiness he felt the night before. That was Julien Montclair's life. Gilded on the outside, gutted on the inside. He was a man drowning in a golden ocean, and no one could see the water rising because they were too busy admiring the gold. And then came the night that changed everything. The Grandeur estate sat on a private island off the southern coast of France. The estate was the Montclair family's crown jewel, a sprawling paradise of marble courtyards and infinity pools and gardens that looked like they had been designed by angels. The main hall alone could hold 1,000 guests beneath ceilings painted with Renaissance-inspired murals. Towering marble columns framed every entrance. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from golden chains, casting light that made the entire space shimmer like the inside of a diamond. Tonight the estate was alive with the annual Montclair Gala. Every powerful name in Europe had answered the invitation. Politicians in dark suits whispered in corners about trade deals and alliances. Fashion moguls draped in couture floated between conversations like exotic birds. Tech billionaires with quiet confidence sipped rare vintages and discussed acquisitions worth more than some countries' entire economies. Old money aristocrats surveyed the room with practiced elegance, judging everything and everyone with a single glance. The music was curated by a world-renowned orchestra flown in from Vienna. The menu had been designed by a 3-Michelin-star chef. The floral arrangements alone had cost more than most people earned in a year. It was excessive. It was dazzling. It was suffocating. And at the center of it all stood Julien. He wore a midnight black suit with a silk lapel. A platinum watch worth more than a house gleamed on his wrist. He held a glass of champagne that he had barely touched. Around him swirled a circle of admirers, diplomats seeking favor, socialites seeking attention, business partners seeking deals. Julien played his part flawlessly. He laughed at the right moments. He offered compliments that sounded sincere. He shook hands with the perfect pressure. He made eye contact that felt intimate but revealed nothing. He was performing. He was always performing. Inside his chest, the familiar emptiness hummed like a low-frequency sound that never stopped. He had grown so accustomed to it that he barely noticed it anymore. It was just part of him now, like a scar that had healed on the surface but still ached when the weather changed. Julien scanned the room. He saw 100 faces, all of them beautiful, all of them polished, all of them looking at him with some version of wanting his attention, wanting his approval, wanting his name attached to theirs. And then his eyes drifted to the far corner of the ballroom, near the service entrance where the catering staff moved in and out with practiced invisibility. A woman was crouched beside a table adjusting a floral centerpiece that had tilted during transport. She was not a guest. That much was immediately obvious. She wore a faded olive green dress, something simple and well-loved, the kind of dress you buy at a second-hand market and keep because it fits just right. Her dark curly hair was pulled into a loose knot at the back of her head. No jewelry, no makeup beyond what might have been a touch of lip balm. Her hands moved carefully among the flowers, adjusting a peony here, straightening a stem of eucalyptus there. She was completely absorbed in what she was doing, completely unaware of the spectacle swirling around her. And that was what stopped Julien mid-breath. Not her beauty, although she was undeniably beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with effort or expense. It was her stillness. In a room full of people trying desperately to be seen, this woman was not performing for anyone. She was simply existing, quietly, authentically, in a space where authenticity was the rarest commodity of all. Her name was Marin Soleil. She was 27 years old, a marine biologist from a small coastal village called Varay-sur-Mer. She had spent the last 4 years studying endangered seagrass meadows along the Mediterranean coast. Her work was underfunded and underappreciated, but she loved it with a fierceness that bordered on devotion. Marin was not supposed to be at the Montclair Gala. Her older sister Colette owned a small flower shop in their village. Colette had been contracted months in advance to provide the floral arrangements for the event. It was the biggest job her shop had ever landed, and Colette had poured weeks of work into creating centerpieces worthy of the Montclair name. But that morning Colette had woken up with a terrible flu, fever, chills, barely able to stand. And so Marin had driven 3 hours in her rusted 12-year-old car, loaded with the final batch of arrangements to deliver them in her sister's place. She had not planned to stay. She had planned to drop off the flowers and drive back home before dark, but the event coordinator had been frantic, short-staffed, overwhelmed. She had practically begged Maren to stay for a few hours to help set up and maintain the arrangements throughout the evening. Maren had agreed reluctantly, and now here she was, crouched beside a table in a faded dress surrounded by billions of dollars worth of wealth and influence, adjusting peonies like they were the most important thing in the world, because to Maren they were. Her sister had arranged every petal with love, and Maren was going to make sure every single one of them was perfect. Julien set down his champagne glass. He excused himself from the circle of diplomats who were mid-conversation about a trade agreement with Asia, something he would normally have been deeply engaged in. But tonight, something else had captured his attention, something he could not explain. He walked across the ballroom, slowly, deliberately, past clusters of guests who tried to catch his eye, past women who angled their bodies toward him hoping he would stop, past waiters carrying trays of appetizers that cost more per bite than Maren earned in a day. He stopped a few feet away from her. She did not notice him. She was focused on a stubborn stem of white ranunculus that refused to sit properly in its arrangement. "You have a gift with flowers," he said. Maren flinched slightly. She turned around and looked up. Their eyes met for the first time. She saw a tall man in an expensive suit with gray eyes and a face that belonged on magazine covers. She noticed the way people across the room kept glancing in his direction. She registered the platinum cufflinks and the air of authority that surrounded him like cologne. But she did not gasp. She did not recognize him. She did not try to flatter or impress. She simply looked at him the way she would look at anyone who had interrupted her work. "They are my sister's work, actually," she said, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. "I'm just the delivery driver tonight." Julien blinked. In a room where every word spoken to him was carefully calculated to impress, that answer was so refreshingly honest it almost made him stumble. "Delivery driver," he repeated, and for the first time that evening a real smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That might be the most honest job title I have heard tonight." Maren studied him for a moment. She was not oblivious to the world she was standing in. She could tell he was someone of importance. The way the room seemed to orbit around him, even from a distance, made that obvious. "You are someone important, are you not?" she asked. Her tone was flat. "Curious, but not impressed. Depends on your definition of important," Julien replied. "My definition involves people who actually make a difference," Maren said without hesitation, "not people who just attend parties." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Julien felt something crack inside his chest. Not pain, something else. Something that felt dangerously close to recognition, like hearing a truth he had known for years but never had the courage to say out loud. He laughed. Not the rehearsed laugh he used at Gallus. Not the diplomatic chuckle he offered to politicians and socialites. A real laugh, deep and warm, and startled out of him like a bird flushed from hiding. Maren raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised by the reaction. And just like that, a conversation began. It started with flowers. Maren explained how her sister selected each bloom, how she believed flowers carried emotions the way music carried melody, how the right arrangement could make a person feel something they could not put into words. Then it shifted to the ocean. Maren's eyes came alive when she talked about the sea. She described bioluminescent plankton lighting up midnight waters like fallen galaxies. She spoke about coral reefs dying in silence while the world argued about stock prices. She talked about seagrass meadows, how they were among the most important ecosystems on Earth, yet almost no one knew they existed. Julien listened, not the way he listened at board meetings, not the way he listened to advisors or diplomats where his mind was already 3 steps ahead calculating outcomes and responses. He listened the way a man listens when he has forgotten what it feels like to hear something real. One conversation became 2. 2 became an hour. The gala swirled around them, but neither of them noticed. Guests danced. Champagne flowed. Speeches were made. None of it registered. Julien found himself telling Maren things he had never told anyone. Not the details of his broken engagement, but the feelings beneath it. The loneliness, the exhaustion of pretending, the hollow ache of being surrounded by people who wanted pieces of him, but never bothered to ask if he was whole. Maren did not offer pity. She did not try to fix him. She simply nodded and said, "I understand what it feels like to be surrounded by noise and still feel completely alone." And Julien believed her, because when she said it, there was no performance in her voice, only truth. As the gala wound down and guests began making their way toward waiting cars and limousines, Julian felt a sensation he had not experienced in years. Dread, not the dread of danger or crisis, the dread of a beautiful moment ending, the fear that once this conversation stopped, the silence that followed would be unbearable. So he did something impulsive, something that went against every rule he had built for himself over the past 3 years. "Come with me," he said softly. "Not to another party, not to impress you. I just do not want this conversation to end." Maren looked at him carefully. She was not a naive woman. She had grown up in a village where fishermen worked 16-hour days and still could not make rent. She had watched her mother age 10 years in the 5 years following her father's death. She knew what the world looked like without filters and fairy tales. And she knew that wealthy men who asked women like her to come with them rarely had honorable intentions. But there was something in Julian's eyes that gave her pause. Behind the confidence, behind the gray storm of his gaze, she saw something fragile, something that looked like hope, and against every instinct telling her to walk away, she nodded. Now pause for a second and think about this. Have you ever made a decision that your brain told you was wrong, but your heart told you was necessary? Have you ever said yes to something terrifying because something deep inside you whispered this matters? If you have, drop a heart emoji in the comments right now. And if you are loving this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because trust me, what happens next is going to stay with you for a long time. Julian did not take Maren to the Grand Montclair yacht, the massive vessel that his family used for publicity events and diplomatic receptions. Instead, he led her down a narrow path along the estate's private dock to a modest sailboat moored quietly at the far end. It was simple by Montclair standards, a 30-foot vessel with a small cabin and a wooden deck weathered by salt and sun. Julian kept it separate from the family fleet. It was his escape, the one place in the world where he did not have to be Prince Julian Montclair. They climbed aboard. The Mediterranean stretched out before them, like a sheet of black silk under a golden moon. The air was warm and carried the scent of salt and distant lavender from the island's gardens. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the occasional cry of a gull somewhere in the darkness. Julian uncorked a bottle of wine, not the rare vintage that had been served at the gala. A simple local red that he kept on the boat. Something inexpensive, something real. They sat on the deck. They drank slowly. And they talked, not the way people talk at parties, not the careful, curated exchange of information designed to impress or protect. They talked the way people talk when they have decided, without fully realizing it, to stop hiding. Maren told him about her father. His name was Lucien. He had been a fisherman in Vaires-sur-Mer for 30 years. A quiet man with sun-weathered hands and a laugh that could fill a room. He had taught Maren to swim before she could walk. He had taken her out on his boat every Sunday morning and showed her the ocean's secrets. The way light moved through water at different depths. The way fish schooled in patterns that mirrored the stars. The way the sea could be violent and gentle in the same breath. Maren was 16 when Lucien's boat went down in a storm. They never recovered his body. The ocean that Maren loved with her entire soul had taken the person she loved most. She told Julian about the guilt she carried. How she had been away at a science academy when her father died. How she had chosen academics over coming home that weekend. How she had replayed that decision 1,000 times, wondering if somehow being there would have changed something, even though she knew logically it would not have. She told him about her mother. How the light in her mother's eyes had dimmed after Lucien's death and never fully returned. How Maren sent half her salary home every month. How she drove 3 hours to deliver her sister's flowers because family was the one currency she would never stop spending. Julian listened to every word, and then quietly, almost reluctantly, he began to share his own story. He did not give her details about his ex-fiancée. He did not name names or describe the scandal that had been whispered about in royal circles for years. Instead, he described the wound itself, the feeling of opening your heart completely to another person and discovering that they had been measuring its value in currency the entire time. He told her how the betrayal had rewired him, how he had stopped believing that love could exist without an agenda, how every interaction with every person in his life now passed through a filter of suspicion and self-protection, how exhausting it was to smile at the world while feeling absolutely nothing inside. "I have everything," Julian said, staring at the moonlight on the water, "and I feel nothing. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and I cannot remember the last time something made me feel alive." Maren was quiet for a long moment. The boat rocked gently beneath them. Then she said something that Julian would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Maybe you were not broken by love," she said softly. "Maybe you were broken by someone who did not know how to carry it." Julian turned to look at her. Her eyes were steady, warm, unafraid. She was not trying to heal him. She was not offering herself as a solution. She was simply naming the truth with a clarity that cut through every wall he had built. And in that moment, something inside Julian shifted. Not dramatically, not like a dam breaking or a light switching on, more like ice beginning to thaw, slowly, quietly, irreversibly. The conversation softened. The wine ran out. The moon climbed higher. And somewhere in the space between one sentence and the next, their fingers touched. Neither of them pulled away. Julian looked at Marin. Marin looked at Julian. And without a word, they both understood that something was happening between them that neither of them had planned for. He kissed her, not with the urgency of a man taking what he wanted, not with the practiced confidence of a prince who had kissed 100 women before. He kissed her the way a man kisses when he is terrified, when every instinct tells him to pull back and protect himself, but something deeper, something braver refuses to let him. Marin kissed him back, and the night unfolded between them, like a story being written in real time. Unscripted, unpredictable, raw. What they shared that night was not just physical. It was emotional surrender. Two people who had been carrying their loneliness like armor finally setting it down. Two people who had convinced themselves they did not deserve connection discovering in each other's arms that they had been wrong. It was the kind of night that changes a person permanently. The kind you cannot undo. The kind that rewrites something fundamental in the way you see the world and yourself. And both of them knew it. Even as it was happening, they knew this was not ordinary. This was not temporary. This was the kind of moment that divides a life into before and after. Dawn came slowly. The sky turned from black to deep violet to streaks of gold over the Mediterranean. The water caught the early light and scattered it in 1,000 directions like liquid amber. Marin opened her eyes. Julian was still sleeping beside her. His face was inches from hers. In sleep, the tension was gone from his jaw. The guardedness had melted from his features. He looked younger, softer, almost vulnerable. Marin watched him for a long time. She memorized the way his eyelashes cast tiny shadows on his cheekbones, the way his chest rose and fell with each slow breath, the way his hand rested near hers, as if even in sleep he was reaching for her. And then fear arrived, not gradually, not politely. It crashed into her like a wave she had not seen coming. What was she doing? She was a marine biologist who earned barely enough to cover her rent and her mother's expenses. She drove a rusted car. She owned exactly one dress nice enough for an evening out, and she was wearing it. She spent her days knee-deep in coastal mud studying organisms most people had never heard of. And he was a prince worth $12 billion. A man whose world was built on power and prestige and centuries of royal legacy. A man surrounded by the most beautiful and accomplished women in Europe. Women like her did not belong in stories written for men like him. That was what Marin told herself as she carefully, quietly slid out from under the thin blanket they had shared. She folded the blanket neatly. She placed her wine glass in the small sink inside the cabin. She stood on the deck for one final moment, looking out at the sea that had shaped her entire life. Then she climbed off the boat. She walked down the dock. She did not leave a phone number. She did not write a note. She left nothing behind. Nothing except the faint scent of salt and wildflowers lingering in the cabin air. When Julian opened his eyes, the sun was fully up. Golden light poured through the cabin windows. The boat rocked gently in the morning current. Everything was warm and still and peaceful, and the space beside him was empty, cold. Julian sat up. "Marin," he called. Silence. He searched the cabin. He climbed up to the deck. He walked the length of the dock, calling her name, his voice growing more urgent with each step. She was gone. No trace, no message, no way to find her. Julian stood barefoot on the sun-warmed wood of the dock. The Mediterranean stretched out before him, endless and indifferent. Behind him, the grandeur estates gleamed in the morning light, like a monument to everything he was supposed to be. And in that moment, the richest prince in Europe understood for the first time in his life what it truly meant to be poor. Because this was not the loss he had experienced 3 years ago. That had been betrayal. Sharp and clean and almost predictable in hindsight. This was different. This was the loss of something genuine, something that had arrived without warning and without agenda, something that had made him feel more alive in a single night than he had felt in 3 years of gilded emptiness. And now it was gone. And the emptiness that rushed in to fill the space Marin had occupied was worse than anything Julian had ever known. Because now the emptiness had a shape. It had a voice. It had dark curly hair and steady warm eyes, and it whispered, "Maybe you were not broken by love," in a tone so gentle it made his chest ache. The weeks that followed were a special kind of agony. Julian returned to his royal duties. He sat through diplomatic meetings. He signed trade agreements. He attended state dinners and smiled for photographers and shook hands with world leaders. But everything felt wrong. Every room was too loud. Every conversation too shallow. Every interaction filtered through a new and painful comparison. He would be speaking with a brilliant, accomplished woman at some royal function and his mind would drift. She does not talk about the ocean the way Marin did. She does not challenge me the way Marin did. She is performing, and she does not even know it. It was unfair. He knew it was unfair, but he could not stop. Marin had shown him what real felt like, and now everything else registered as artificial. He tried to find her, discreetly, carefully. He could not exactly announce to the world that Prince Julian Montclair was searching for a woman he had met for one night whose last name he was not even sure of. He contacted the event coordinator for the gala. She provided the name of the florist who had been contracted for the arrangements. A small shop called Soleil Fleurs in a village called Vaires-sur-Mer. Julian's personal assistant made the call. A woman answered, Colette. When the assistant explained that Prince Montclair wished to speak with her sister, Colette's voice turned cold. "My sister is not interested in being found by rich men," she said firmly. "She has been hurt enough." The line went dead. Julian sat in his office staring at the phone. She has been hurt enough. What did that mean? What had Marin endured that he did not know about? What wounds was she carrying beneath that calm, radiant composure that had captivated him so completely? The questions haunted him. But more than the questions, what haunted him was the silence, the absence, the Marin-shaped void in his life that nothing and no one could fill. Months passed, and something unexpected began to happen. Julian started to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a river slowly changing course. He began questioning the foundations of his life, the galas that felt hollow, the performances that exhausted him, the empire he was expected to inherit and expand without ever asking whether it was what he truly wanted. He started redirecting his foundation's resources toward causes that mattered to him personally. Environmental conservation, marine protection, education programs for coastal communities. His advisors were confused. His family was concerned, but Julian did not care. Because Marin had planted a seed that night on the sailboat, a seed that said importance is not measured by wealth or title. It is measured by impact, by difference, by the courage to care about something beyond yourself. And that seed was growing. Even in her absence, Marin was changing him. Even without knowing it, she was reshaping the man he was becoming. And still the ache did not fade. If anything, it deepened, because now Julian was not just missing a woman. He was missing the version of himself that only seemed to exist when she was near. Then fate did what fate does best. It intervened without warning. Julian's foundation had committed funding to a marine conservation initiative along the southern coast of France. The project focused on protecting endangered seagrass meadows that supported fragile coastal ecosystems. It was a small initiative by Montclair standards. His advisors told him it was not worth a personal visit. Too remote, too modest. No media value. But something pulled Julian toward that coastline, something he could not name or explain, a quiet, insistent tug in his chest that said, go. So he went. He arrived in Vaires-sur-Mer on a Tuesday afternoon. The village was everything the Montclair world was not. Small stone cottages with shutters painted in faded blues and greens, a tiny harbor where fishing boats rocked gently in the tide. Narrow cobblestone streets lined with wildflowers growing from cracks in ancient walls. The air smelled of salt and rosemary and something indefinably warm. Above the harbor, perched on the cliffs overlooking the sea, sat a modest research station, a converted stone building with large windows facing the water and a hand-painted sign that read, Centre de Conservation Maritime de Vaires-sur-Mer. Julian walked through the door. The interior was simple, functional. Water tanks lined one wall filled with samples of seagrass and marine organisms. Research papers and charts covered a long wooden table. A group of university students sat in folding chairs listening intently to someone speaking at the front of the room. And that someone was Marin. She stood beside a large water tank, her hands moving expressively, as she explained the critical role of Posidonia oceanica in Mediterranean ecosystems. Her lab coat was at least 2 sizes too big. Her curly hair was wilder than he remembered, falling around her face in untamed spirals. Her eyes were bright with the kind of passion that cannot be manufactured or taught. She was magnificent. She was more than magnificent. She was everything. Julien could not move, could not breathe, could not do anything except stand in that doorway and watch the woman who had haunted his every waking moment for 4 months doing exactly what she was born to do. Then she turned. Their eyes met across the room. The students, the water tanks, the research papers, the entire world fell away. Marin's face went through a series of emotions so rapid they were almost impossible to track. Shock, disbelief, fear, and then something else, something that looked achingly, desperately like relief. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered against the stone floor. "Julien," she whispered. The sound of his name in her voice, after 4 months of silence, nearly broke him. He stepped forward. 1 step, then another, slowly, carefully, like a man approaching something sacred, something he was terrified might disappear if he moved too quickly. The students looked between them, confused. Julien did not notice them. He stopped an arm's length from Marin. "You disappeared," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands were trembling at his sides. Marin swallowed hard. "I had to," she said quietly. "Why?" "Because you are Prince Julien, and I am a woman who studies seagrass in a village most people have never heard of. We do not belong in the same story." Julien shook his head slowly. "You are wrong," he said, "and you know you are wrong. Because if we did not belong in the same story, then why does every other story feel meaningless without you in it?" Marin's eyes glistened. She took a step back, not out of rejection, but out of self-protection. The same instinct that had driven her off the boat that morning. The same fear that whispered, "You do not deserve this." "Julien, I cannot live in your world," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "I do not know how to attend galas. I do not own a single piece of clothing that costs more than 40 euros. I study seagrass. I drive a rusted car. I send half my salary home to my mother. I am not the kind of woman who ends up with a prince." Julien listened to every word, and then he said something that shattered every wall Marin had ever built. "I do not want you to live in my world." She blinked. "What?" He took 1 more step forward, close enough now to see the freckles scattered across her nose, close enough to smell the faint trace of salt water on her skin, close enough to see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "I want to build a new world," he said. "With you. Not my world. Not your world. Ours." The room was completely silent. Even the students had stopped breathing. "I am not offering you a crown," Julien continued, and his voice trembled with an emotion he had never allowed anyone to hear. "I am not offering you wealth or status or access to some golden cage. I am offering you me, the real me, the version of me that only exists when you were in the room, the version that laughed for the first time in 3 years because a woman in an olive green dress told me that important people are the ones who make a difference, not the ones who attend parties." He reached for her hand. "You changed me, Marin. That night on the boat, you did not just make me feel something. You made me want to be something, something better, something real. And I have spent every single day since you left trying to become the man who deserves to stand in front of you and say what I am saying right now." Marin looked down at his hand holding hers. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. A Sunday morning on his fishing boat, the sun just coming up over the water, his weathered hand on her small shoulder. The bravest thing a person can ever do, ma petite, is to let someone love them, because it means trusting the world with the softest part of who you are. Marin had carried those words for 11 years. She had used them to fuel her work, her education, her dedication to the ocean her father loved, but she had never applied them to her own heart. Until now, she looked up at Julien. His gray eyes were unguarded, open, vulnerable in a way she had never seen from any man, let alone a prince worth $12 billion. He was not performing. He was not calculating. He was simply standing in front of her asking to be loved, and that was the bravest thing Maren had ever witnessed. "Okay," she whispered. One word. One single word. But it carried the weight of every wall she had ever built crumbling, every fear she had ever hidden behind dissolving, every lie she had ever told herself about not being enough shattering into 1,000 pieces. Julien pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in his life, Prince Julien Montclair did not feel like a prince. He felt like a man who was finally irrevocably and completely home. If this moment gave you chills, and I know it did do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, because stories like this do not come around often, and I promise you the ending is even more beautiful than you think. 2 years later, the world watched in astonishment. Every major news outlet carried the same headline: Prince Julien Montclair, heir to the $12 billion Montclair dynasty, announces engagement to marine biologist from fishing village. The reactions ranged from disbelief to admiration to outright scandal. Royal commentators debated whether the match was appropriate. Society columnists questioned whether a woman without title or fortune could survive the pressures of royal life. But Julien and Maren did not care about headlines. They cared about each other. The wedding was held on the cliffs of Vers-sur-Mer, not in the grand halls of the Montclair estate, not in a cathedral filled with dignitaries and cameras. On the cliffs above the sea that had shaped Maren's entire existence, the same sea that had taken her father, the same sea that had brought Julien to her door. The ceremony was small, intimate, meaningful. Maren wore white wildflowers woven into her curly hair instead of a diamond tiara. Her dress was simple and elegant, and she had chosen it herself from a small boutique in the village. No designer labels, no royal stylist. Julien wore a simple dark suit, no medals, no royal sash, no platinum cufflinks. Just a man standing on a cliff above the ocean waiting for the woman who had saved his life without even trying. Colette stood as maid of honor. She began crying before the ceremony even started, and did not stop until well after it ended. She held a bouquet she had arranged herself. Peonies and eucalyptus and white ranunculus, the same flowers that had been on the table at the gala the night everything began. Maren's mother Elise sat in the front row. In her weathered hands she clutched a photograph of Lucien, her late husband, Maren's father, the fisherman who had taught his daughter that the bravest thing a person could do was let someone love them. As the ceremony began, Elise whispered to the photograph she held against her heart, "She found him, Lucien. She finally found him." The officiant spoke of love and partnership, and the courage it takes to build something real in a world that so often settles for imitation. And then Julien spoke his vows. He did not speak of kingdoms or legacies or the weight of the Montclair name. He looked into Maren's eyes, and he spoke from the most honest place inside himself. "You taught me that love is not a performance," he said. "It is not a transaction. It is not something you earn or deserve or negotiate. Love is what happens when two people are brave enough to be seen completely and still choose to stay. I spent years believing that love was a myth, a story people told themselves to survive the loneliness. And then I met a woman who straightened flowers at a gala full of billionaires and talked about dying coral reefs like they were living poetry. And in one single night, she made me feel more alive than I had felt in my entire life. I do not stand here today as a prince. I stand here as a man, your man, and I promise you for the rest of my days I will never stop choosing to stay." Maren could not speak through her tears. She tried. She opened her mouth and no words came. So she did the only thing that felt true. She placed her hand over his heart, and she nodded. Because some promises do not need words. Some promises are written in touch, in presence, in the quiet, unwavering decision to show up for another person every single day for the rest of your life. The sun set over the Mediterranean as they sealed their vows. The sky turned gold and violet and deep amber. The sea below the cliffs caught the dying light and held it shimmering like a promise that would never be broken. And somewhere in the sound of the waves crashing against the ancient rocks below, there was the echo of a fisherman's laughter, warm and proud and infinite. Now let me leave you with this. The greatest love stories do not begin in palaces or ballrooms. They do not require titles or fortunes or fairy tale introductions. They do not follow scripts or timelines or the expectations of the world. The greatest love stories begin in the most unexpected places. A tilted flower arrangement at a gala where you do not belong. A borrowed dress that costs less than the appetizers being served around you. A conversation that was never supposed to happen with a person you were never supposed to meet. And one night on the sea beneath a golden moon where two lonely souls found the courage to stop hiding from the one thing they both desperately needed: each other. Love does not care about your bank account. It does not care about your title or your bloodline or the size of your house. Love cares about one thing and one thing only. Are you brave enough to be seen? Are you brave enough to let someone pass the walls you have built around the softest part of who you are? Because if you are, then love will find you. Not when you are looking for it. Not when you have your life perfectly arranged, but in the messy, unscripted, beautifully imperfect moments when you least expect it. And real is the rarest luxury of all. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love does not follow a script, then do 3 things for me right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story today. Because you never know, maybe their greatest love story is just one unexpected moment away. This is Mr. Andy Love Stories, and I will see you in the next one.